Audrey?
No, I totally agree. It's true that I would love to also read a more detailed sociology of the all of the efforts that's been operated in Georgia. I know that in the case of Stacey Abrams, her parents were also activists in and leading the efforts to having people being registered to vote. And it's also interesting if you go on the various projects websites that one of the first thing once you type you're interested, you want to be on the newsletter, the second page is okay, so how much can you donate, like $7, $10, 15, 100 more, do you want to give monthly, etc. And it's true. I've read some thing that she wrote, and I listened to some of her speeches, and and I've always been so surprised by her. She has something both very strong. She's clearly on what could be called the left, and she's also very pragmatic and very ambitious and doesn't hide it. There's a mix. She's clearly mobilizing what she wants, more money, and at the same time she's fighting in the court. There's something very interesting in her personality. Of course, it's backed on organizations on the ground in Georgia, but also out of Georgia. But I think that this, like her strong interest in kind of addressing the issues of the various communities she's trying to, build within one coalition in Georgia. It's basically what she did when when she lost the governorship, but she drew a really high number of Democratic votes to her under her name. So I think that there's this very strong, both pragmatic and progressive effort that is made by her. But you have also other personalities in other organizations that are, as was said, are not going to officially back the Democratic Party, but are going to push the effort. So in that city, the platform of the Democratic Party will have to move. Otherwise, we're going to, have someone that's going to run in the primary and that might beat you. So, and we are doing all of this effort. And I think that seeing all of these different types of efforts towards one objective is really something fascinating, especially from France, where the left seems so, I don't know how to put it.
So let's not. That would be all another conversation. Yeah. You have my number, you can call me.
There's something very, pragmatic without being this neoliberal efforts. And I think that's something that's very interesting and in what's going on right now.
Yeah, we could think of Cory Bush also in St. Louis.
Maybe, Kathy, you could illustrate what has been said until this point with your work at the University of Chicago, at the community service centers with young students and helping them to commit themselves and to go to politics. And what does it say to you? What's their perspective on that? Are they planning to move the Democratic Party, or are they planning to do something else?
Great question. So I'd say the University Community Service Center pushes civics, like civic education, where voting is one component of that. So for the voting specific things, we partnered with the Institute of Politics to really work with here on campus to partner with students to get them that information. So a lot of them were voting for the first time, or so like anything, mail-in ballots weren't, like all of these sort of issues. And so the Institute of Politics really on campus sort of led that effort to get them prepared. On the community service side, we tried to embed that in communities. So we did a lot of voter suppression work with the Chicago Urban League and allowed students to support in that effort to identify what does it look like when, like, are these things okay? Is it okay to ask somebody for their ID? Oh, so many things. Is it okay for these lines to be so long? Is it okay? Like all these things. And so what you would see the students were doing is, in addition to voting, they would go on an app, for example, and send a pizza to people who were voting in really long lines in the community, because they recognize that some older people in particular would leave because of a need for food. So you saw them sort of practicing civics in these sort of new ways for them that very much drew on like technology and social media and all of these things that hadn't been in play before. Another really important thing that we learned is that some medical doctors, and I forget what the org is called, but they were even allowing, they could give patients like voting information when they gave them their like takeaway stuff from ER visits. So we were finding our students were supporting in those endeavors too, because our students are embedded in like community organizations. So I think it was a great opportunity for students to see voting is a major roadway, but there's all these other ways that you can support a larger civic effort and get involved with the community. Because, you know, the University of Chicago has an evolving tradition with our sort of the space here and the South Side. And so our students don't often come with the greatest ideas about what the city of Chicago is, what Black people are in Chicago. So this was a tremendous effort for them to, one, feel invested in the city, like that was worthwhile, for them to feel safe and comfortable around people who often look different from them. So there was a lot of takeaways that came using sort of voting as a carrot, but what hopefully will keep them engaged in politics outside of their 4 years here at the university. So hopefully that answered some of the things you were asking.
Okay. Michael, Kathy has just talked about the concern about suppression, the vote suppressions. We had talked about that before the election, and after the election, what's your look on what happened? Do you see the mail-in ballots as a good solution against the attempt of suppressing Black votes? Because there were attempts, I think about Texas, where there was just one ballot for a whole country, for instance, or other places.
Yes, I think that we just have to be vigilant when it comes to voter suppression. I think if I was a Republican strategist, one of my takeaways is we have to ramp up efforts of voter suppression. Our candidate got 70+ million votes, far more than any other candidate had, except our opposition got almost 5 million more than that. And the people who who beat us in Pennsylvania, the people that beat us in Michigan are these people who live in urban areas. These are people who are either immigrants or First Nations, as has been mentioned, or Latinx or Black folks. And even when we put a dent into the percentages, they still tipped elections out, in the direction away from the Republican Party. We saw in Florida, there's of course a lot of targeted voter outreach in Florida by the Republican Party, but there was also a successful attempt to nullify felons being able to vote after the passing of the referendum. We mentioned in Texas, banning counties from having multiple drop-offs. Poll taxes, Pat mentioned this before, poll taxes, having to pay to vote. Limiting hours. Part of this is the trying to end the census early so that the way that state legislators boundaries get built and representation in Congress. So it's going to be an ongoing effort. And one of the problems with the US electoral cycle is that there's often really, I can think of the Jesse Jackson campaigns, for example, in the 80s, a lot of mobilization around the election. And then maybe a month or two after that, there's nothing for 3 years. And if that happens, then I wouldn't be shocked if the outcome of the 2024 elections are the opposite of what happened this time.
Papa, maybe on this suppressing Black votes issue.
Obviously, there is such a long history of voter suppression in the United States. It's been the history of the US since the late 18th century is a history of voter suppression. I mean, it's very much tied to that. If you look at the US Constitution, there's nothing on citizenship, for example. The word citizen is not even printed in the Constitution. It would just show up much later with the 14th Amendment following the Civil War. There is nothing on voting rights because the fathers of the Constitution did not agree on universal suffrage. We did not agree. They didn't agree on many issues. So all those issues were swept under the rug, and the Constitution is extremely vague on so many issues. So there's a 200+ years of debates around who can vote, what is citizenship. Literally, is citizenship linked to voting rights, for example? And it was not obvious for such a long time in the US. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind when looking at all the efforts being made, because as I said, I believe that there is a long memory. There are local memories of efforts made even decades ago when it came to trying to enfranchise people and fight white supremacy, for example, when it comes to African Americans, when it comes to inmates and people out of jail. There's also such a long history of their voting rights being suppressed or discussed. It's been the case since the late 19th century. So there is a kind of longue durée history behind all these issues. Now, just a word on what is going to happen with Biden being in the White House. It's going to be interesting to look at all the grassroots movements, including Black Lives Matter, to see whether they manage to shift gears and move to another phase of their activism with someone who is not Trump at the White House, someone who does not mobilize against him the way Trump did for many years, and also the way they managed to use Biden and the White House to move forward when discussing the reform of police departments. In Biden's program, there are some things on the reform of the police departments. He's very prudent, obviously, but I'm very curious to see what's going to happen in the months to come, and whether BLM can and grassroots groups can use the new political time to their advantage. It's not completely obvious. You could think, well, good times are coming. Well, you know, things are a little fuzzy, and that's an open question, of course. But it is obviously a victory that with the defeat of Trump, but the Biden and the White House is not necessarily good news. It all depends on the kind of political action and pressure that the activists will manage to do.
To pursue on this matter, which is really important, Audrey, I'll try to express that simply because it's quite complicated in my head, and in English it's going to be even more complicated to express. But as I understand, you have this mobilization that is more on the left than the Democratic Party is today. And Joe Biden was elected saying he's going to take the country back to put the country back together. So it's not going to end on the left side of the political chessboard. So my question would be: can we really be optimistic on the ability to this movement to press up their agenda, or should we be more pessimistic, according to you?
I'm not super optimistic. Because I mean, there's been a lot of articles on Trump is gone, but Trumpism is there to stay, and I believe it's true. And I was talking just a few minutes earlier about all of the work within the Democratic Party. The thing is, I think that a number of activists that have been part of a number of movements locally do not really buy the whole rhetoric of, oh, it's great, now it's changing, it's going back, because they don't believe in the fact that you know, the whole rhetoric of, oh, that's not who we are. And they're like, yeah, that's exactly what the US is about. I think that one, I agree with Pap in the sense that I don't think that a federal initiative pushed by Harris and Biden is going to be a, you know, game changer here. I think that it's clearly the multiplicity of local mobilizations of like trying to put some pressure on that specific police departments in that other place. And I really think that their agenda might advance like this, but it's true that I don't believe that the climate, I think that the climate is going to be maybe a little less hostile, because it was clearly, it is, and it was very dangerous in the last 4 years. I mean, Trump's term started with a will to label Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization. So it started in a very hostile environment, but it also started under Obama. So it means that clearly I agree with the fact that it's not going to be a good environment to advance an agenda, even though, and maybe there are going to be strong federal efforts, but I really believe that, and I think that a number of activists believe that too, that the local level, the city level, are going to be very key, and with some pressure to be put on political parties during all of the elections that happen like every 2 years in the US. Well, that's how I see it.
Can I just add something too really quickly, because
yes,
I think what Audrey is saying is profound, and let us not forget that under President Barack Obama, right, we had Sandra Bland, we had Eric Gardner, we had Trayvon Martin. So it's not like these things stop happening because there's a Democrat or a person of color, right? Like these things aren't going to stop happening because we have our first woman VP. So I think to Audrey's point, like it's yet to be seen. This does feel like a lesser of two evils. And honestly, I mean, like Trump said at one point, like stand guard and be ready. Like it is a less hostile environment, but I think Black and brown people in the US are clear about how violence is exerted in non you know, easily displayed ways, right? How violence manifests itself in the prison system and sort of these things that we have a luxury sometimes of not being a part of. So I think for me, I believe it's fair to say that we don't know. We don't know about Biden Harris, and simply because they're Democrats doesn't help the most vulnerable people with intersecting identities sleep at night.
Michael, one should be more optimistic with a socialist president at the White House. Of course, I'm kidding, but about this difference between the mobilization we've seen in the streets, so to speak, and this Democratic Party. What's your perspective on that?
So I guess one of the ways I could be optimistic, and I guess I am optimistic, is that the mobilization started under Obama, not under Trump. So there's no reason to think they're going to stop because Biden is the president. And I couldn't agree more with Audrey and Coffee that as one of the guests who pointed out, Biden didn't run on the left. He ran as a centrist. He ran against the left in the Democratic Party during the primary season. He's much like Barack Obama on class issues that you would think he could get a majority support for. He's against them. He's against the Green New Deal. He's against Medicare for all. So one of the curses of the two-party system is that this might be, I don't think this is much of an overstatement. If it is an overstatement, as several other panelists have pointed out, we're looking at something like a civil war within the Democratic Party, and probably the Republican Party too, as well. Unless it's been totally captured by Trumpism, which might well be the case. But as was pointed out, the Sunday talk shows were, oh, we lost a down ballot because all those damn lefties and people of color pushing us too far to the left. And there's been pushback saying, no, those are the people who have done well, actually. The socialists are getting elected at the local level. It's the neoliberals that are having problems everywhere. You can't out-Trump the Trumpists. You can't you can't go to the right of the right in this country. So I think that there will be, the cause for optimism is the continued mobilization and expansion of progressive forces. These BYP 100, Movement for Black Lives, they started by concentrating on local issues and bringing national attention to local issues. I think that's where the focus will go. One of the reasons for the turn to electoral politics was to get rid of racist prosecutors at the local level, whether it was Chicago, Philadelphia, or elsewhere. So I think we'll see a deepening and expansion of those type of efforts throughout the country.
Overall, did this election show the strength of American democratic institution, the strength of its political system, or an electoral system, should I say, or was it just last chance to save to save the system, and that's what happened? What do you think, Pat?
Well, the system is badly flawed, as we know. Trump was elected 4 years ago, and he has less of a popular vote than Hillary Clinton. At least this year, Biden has at least 5 million popular votes than Trump, which is a better situation. But we could go on and on about the electoral system and the fact that voters in South Dakota have more political weight than in California because of the indirect system. Anyway, there are so many issues, and we talked about voter suppressions and so on and so forth. So that's clearly a very unfair system. To follow up on what Kathy and Michael and Audrey said, there is clearly a debate, an ongoing debate between the left and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the mainstream, so to speak, part of the Democratic Party with Biden, and I've watched on the news some kind of bitter debate between Democrats on these issues. Obviously, as Michael said, some Democrats accusing the progressives of being too far on the left and being responsible for the lackluster performance of the Democratic Party. I was interested in what Alessandra Ocasio-Cortez said. She said, well, we should not point fingers at the progressives. They were responsible for the massive grassroots movement we were talking about. But she also added in a very pragmatic way that it also all depends on where you are. If you are in the Bronx, if you are in the south side of Chicago, you have more possibilities to move to the left than if you are a Democratic candidate in Tennessee or in Southern Illinois. So she also acknowledges that the agenda can also be, I wouldn't say custom tailored, but adapted to local realities. And I think that's also an important point. The strength of the Democratic Party is to bring together different people. And we have to acknowledge that, yes, there are moderate Democrats, people who are not, can be a little middle of the road persons on many, many issues. And they are also important when building a political coalition and having Democratic candidates elected. So it is difficult. It is a difficult conversation. There are tensions, etc. But it is something that is a necessity to keep together a large group of people, sometimes people who disagree with each other, but who can agree on a minimum, a kind of, basic platform that should include, I think that's the minimum, that should include a fight against racial prejudice, discriminations, and ways to make sure that African American citizens and people of color in general are not discriminated and obviously being victims of police violence and other forms of brutality. I still hope that this is possible, and I still hope that even among mainstream Democrats, moderate Democrats, there is still the possibility for reforms, progressive reforms when it comes to racial equality.
So, Kathy, you think also that there is a ground for this discussion between the more progressive and the more centrist part of the Democratic Party, and that racial issues are this ground, is this ground of conversation?
That I do, and I think I said this before, but to be Black in America is to maintain that hope that those conversations can happen and that accountability can come from it. But I think while maintaining that hope, similar to the work of Charlene, we don't stop advocating. So it's not like sort of hope waiting. It's like hope, but we're still going to hold you accountable. We're still going to march. We are going to protest. We're going to hold you accountable for our vote. So yes, to your point, I do believe that I have optimism for those kinds of conversations really around race. And I think we're sort of moving back into a space where we can talk about race openly. I know that, Trump had the new decree that was impacting universities' even ability to talk about race and give like racial training. So I am eager to see what this new administration does and the ways that we can have those kinds of conversations again.
Very different from what's happening in France. Audrey, you were stressing that out earlier. Maybe you want to add something about this possible conversation that we're talking about?
Well, not much. I agree with everything that's been said. But it's true that it's interesting to see almost a sort of international concerted effort to erase critical race theory everywhere it exists, or it's trying to, right? Because it's not, I mean, there aren't big departments working on these questions in France, but it's interesting. But when I say interesting, I mean disturbing to see that it's actually happening in a number of places at the same time, and that it's true that when you try and actually understand what it means to work with an intersectional perspective, when you actually advocate for a more sophisticated sociology of racial and ethnic dynamics, it's kind of hard to see that it's actually being totally challenged, maybe because precisely that's a common ground on which we could all build a very progressive society for all, and it's not considered a good thing for some, but it's well, that's my take on this.
Does everyone wants to add something to what just has been said? I mean, I hadn't planned to talk about what's happening in Université, but obviously it's a good place to do so, Michael.
So I would just add that I might slightly disagree. This is not my critical race theory side, but my public opinion researcher side. I think that the left in the US has had more success talking about class issues and economic issues and racial issues. And I think we see what happened to some of the ballot issues in places like California around affirmative action is that I absolutely agree we have to have conversations about race, but I don't know if that's where we're going to first make progress. So I think we have to keep that type of duality, find the areas where we can agree, but also talk about the hard ones that have kept us apart for way over a century in the left and among progressives and liberals. In terms of the universities, there's some universities, including one that has a center in Paris, that were running scared. We're talking about, for example, maybe looking at the lawyers looking at maybe should we maybe curb talk about critical race theory. Well, that's what I do. So I'm not curbing anything, and unless you're going to try to take tenure away from me, then that would be an interesting fight. So there was a lot of panicking. The threat against Princeton, that since you admitted to having a history of racism that needed to be addressed, we're going to take federal funds away from you. So it was getting to an extreme level that had administrations in all types of universities panicked. Maybe, as several of the panelists have suggested, this means that we can have a sane conversation about the appropriateness, not just about racial conflict and dynamics, about how we should study these dynamics and what place they have in the academy, which is sometimes a conversation that's been muted over the last 4 years.
Pap, you want to?
Yeah, well, just to follow up on the university situation, the French situation is vastly different, of course, since we've just started actually to talk about that. We've just started to the critical race theory, post-colonial studies have just taken off in France for years behind the US, of course. So it's not, we're not to the point where we, would need to stop and pause and think about what's going on. We're just facing, as Audrey said, we're just facing extremely brutal attack coming from the Minister of Education itself, targeting scholars who study issues, just issues that should be and should seem obvious to all of us, people studying racial discrimination, people studying colonial history and post-colonial history and so on and so forth, or even gender studies. All those people have been targeted following the horrible murder of terrorist attack that took place in outside Paris a few weeks ago. So it's very hard these days in France, as we are facing this extremely brutal attack coming from the minister who should be defending us, not attacking us. So it is clearly different, and we are also facing in France a very highly conservative, nasty offensive in the intellectual world, in the academia, but also in politics. And that's a good thing also that Trump was defeated last week. That's a nice fringe benefit, which is that the the most rightist organizations in France, which were very much hoping for Trump's victory and were betting on Trump, have suffered a defeat also, a political defeat. They cannot build on Trump's victory as they were hoping. So that's also good news for us in many ways. But again, we're in the middle of a very difficult time when, and I do not consider myself as a super radical scholar. That's not the case, but I feel under attack, and this is obviously a difficult time for us.
So we spent more than 1 hour talking. We didn't talk 1 second about COVID-19, which is a good thing, maybe because we're fed up with that. But I really had a question about that and the importance of the context, given that Afro-Americans community is more severely hit by this COVID-19. But let's not talk about that right now, because we are coming to the end of the discussion, unless someone wants to had something, and maybe we can have some question. I see some of them are being written on the wall, but first one of the panelists maybe wants to add something on what has been said. No. Okay. So Clara Federici is pointing out the fact that, so we're talking about France there. So he's pointing out the fact that in France also there have been a movement like La Vérité pour Adama, following the murder of Adama Traoré, who is a young Black French who was murdered by the police. Audrey had a question about that, because I know you've written a piece about this question, and it's the parallel that can be made between France and the US. I mean, following what Pap has just said, one of the arguments is saying, talking about race or talking about post-colonialism is an Americanization, which is not a good word in French, Americanization of the research of the university. So maybe you can tell us a few words about that, how we can find similarities. Well, it's not just Black Lives Matter is not La Vérité pour Adama, but you can have similarities.
Well, the thing is, there's actually a pretty long history of mobilization in poor neighborhoods against police brutality in France. It's not new. It's not something that started with Adama. So it's already, I mean, sometimes bizarre to hear that, oh, it's an Americanization. Actually, people have been organizing in some neighborhoods for several decades in the case of France. Yeah, and my main argument in that paper was basically, of course, there's a difference of scale. No one can deny that. And there's a difference in the organization of the police in the two countries, in a number of things. There are a lot of differences in the commonality, and the reasons why the movement La Vérité pour Adama is actually gaining ground, that in the wake of the George Floyd killing, the slogans that existed in the US resonated with what existed in France. It doesn't mean that it's the same situation. It doesn't mean that it's exactly the same type of mobilization, even though that committee is actually having a sort of radical perspective on capitalism, on a number of social and economic issues that kind of resembles things that you have in part of the Black Lives Matter movement. So to that sense, it's actually, and I think that there are exchanges between leaders, etc. But La Vérité pour Adama is just a very recent episode in a very long history that's not really well known even in France. But clearly, to a certain extent, there was a very beautiful dissertation by Sciences Po students a few months ago, Elodie Druez, who compared discriminations against Black people in France and the UK, and explained that confronted by the same situation in France and in the UK, French Black people didn't have the language to actually politicize their experience of politicization, that they would tell the same stories, except that they don't have the language to say, oh, this is discrimination, this is systemic discrimination, etc. And that was very interesting because in June, when there were like these important mobilizations in France, people had the language. Actually, Black Lives Matter meant something in the French context, and they knew what it resonated with. And true that I see that there were demonstrations in the French Caribbean islands, and that's maybe
we don't have time. That would be another story.
Yeah, it's a long story.
Does someone wants to add something? Maybe. No, we don't have much question in France. It's not possible because ethnic statistics. That's another story too. Ethnic statistic in France. I don't know if Pap, you want to say something about that, because it's not so obvious that you can't have you can't have ethnic statistic, but someone like François Héran, who is an important demographer in France and worked on immigration, says that you can actually make specific statistic on Black people or whatever group you want to stress out.
That it is commonly thought that ethnic statistics or racial statistics are not possible in France, but they are. It's more complicated than in the US for sure. It's not as well accepted, but there are many ways to conduct such statistics. There are the legal, the legal dimension is more complicated than in France, but it is possible. It is possible to conduct this kind of and have some statistics. We have some statistics on racial profiling by the police, for example. We have some statistics. I'm building some statistics on diversity at the opera in Paris. You see, that's one example, and it's complicated, of course, but it is possible. So I want to insist on that. It is possible, and we have some statistics. Now it's not the only condition for an effective policy fighting discrimination, but I agree on the fact that we need statistics. We need to objectify the reality and have the possibility to compare and see how things move on. If it's better, the situation now is better than a few years ago. It is a little difficult in France, but it is possible.
Round this up. I don't know if someone wants to add something. I'm checking on the questions, and we have comments. Thank you for having addressed some of the issues in France as well. So that's done. That will be all another discussion, because I think the differences are often stressed between our two countries, but they're not so effective differences. But there are also a lot to say. To compare the two situations. So I guess, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you.
Great talk.
Yeah.
Great conversation.
Learned a lot.
Yes.
So everything was recorded. So I guess somehow it will be possible to see it again for those who missed something.
Thank you.
Allow me to say just a couple of words just to conclude.
Yes, of course.
I'm sorry for having joined so late. One of the downsides of Zoom is that, of course, we often experience technical difficulties. That being said, one of the small silver linings of the COVID era is that we can actually organize events such as these with people who are essentially on two different sides of the Atlantic, and create these particular spaces of conversation, particularly at times as Michael and Pap and others were mentioning, we're in the university and certain critical forms of discourse and analysis are being under assault. So this creates particular sort of spaces of hope and freedom. And I'm very happy that in our small way, we were able to participate in the fashioning of this. I really wanted to sort of thank all of the panelists for so very kindly accepting our invitation. This was an incredibly generative, incredibly rich and nuanced event. In ways that vastly surpass the kinds of things that we can actually sort of hear in airwaves these days. So thank you so much for your contribution to these conversations. Thank you so much also to Raphael for so very kindly moderating the event. Our partners as well, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago, as well as AOC. We're very thankful for your participation. On a very personal note, I was extremely impressed by again, this willingness to sort of think about the Black vote as both a social and political fact, but also tack in its complex ways in which it's actually sort of configured and nuanced by long traditions of sociology, history, the dynamics of certain forms of capital, as well as other kinds of intersectional sets of issues, such as, of course, race, gender, class, sexuality, and so on and so forth. Very encouraged as well, perhaps by the invitation and the overture to think comparatively between France and the United States. So maybe we should all meet together and sort of make an appointment in our notebooks for round 2 of this conversation at some point. And I would be very pleased, as Michael was mentioning, given the University of Chicago's somewhat tepid effort with engaging with issues of race in a manner that is both critical and accountable. It would be my very pleasure if we were able to actually mobilize our energies once more and then organize one such event. So thank you again so much to all of you for your participation, and I look forward to further conversations.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Bye.